Hello, this is James Hudnall and another episode of Creative Secrets. This is about story structure. I'm going to focus on 3-act story structure because that is the most common structure that we're familiar with usually. There are other story structures and I will get into those. I will cover it a little bit here. For now, I just want to cover the 3-act structure and how it works. It's going to take a couple videos to get there, but we'll start by talking about what is a 3-act structure. The 3-act structure is a beginning, middle, and end. The first act is the introduction. The second part is the rising action, as it's sometimes called. And then the third act is the climax. So what is an act exactly? An act is a section of a story, and the act has components that make it a complete story in and of itself, but it is part of a whole. So when I say it's complete story, what I mean is that it has the structure of a beginning, middle, and end, but on a miniature level. So it's not the complete story, but it's more like the setup to a larger piece. In fact, the first act is usually called the setup. The setup is where you introduce the characters and the story idea. You show the situation that the character is in, and then it ends with the turning point. The turning point is what they had in the story circle as go, or in the hero's journey as the call to adventure. It's basically the motivation for the character to get out of their life as it is at the beginning of the story and enter an unknown world of danger and excitement potentially. But of course, like if it's a romance story or something, it might not be so dangerous. But the point is that it gets the character motivated to make a change in their life. Now I'll break that down in a second, but first I want to get into other types of structures besides the 3-act structure so you can just see it in comparison. You can do a story in one act, and that would be in the case of, let's say, a comic, it would be like a setup, beat, punchline type comic strip. That would be like a 1-act story. So it would be the setup would be the first panel, the middle would be the beat, or the middle 2 panels, and then the last panel would be the punchline. In comedy, they usually use 2-act structure. 2-act structure would be the first act is you get the characters into trouble, and the second act you get them out of trouble. That's usually the way comedies work on television, for example. And then you can have 5-act structures. A large comic book series, like a collected volume that makes 6, even 10 issues, could be broken into 5 or more acts. Or a movie or a TV series, let's say a TV series where one season, a show like True Detective, for example, it has 8 episodes. You could break that into multiple acts, more than just 3. So a lot of times, 5-act structure is something that's used. But you can do more acts than that. I mean, that's how it can work. However, the more acts you add, it's a matter of maintaining the interest and the attention of people. What's good about acts is that they give you a focus. An act focuses people's attention on the immediate thing. And then when you move into the next act, it answers questions that are raised in the previous act and expands on them. And it brings things to a conclusion in the case of a 3-act structure. And then the turning point is the resolution act, where everything climaxes. We'll get into that in a sec, but I just wanted to give you this overview of what a 3-act structure is and what act structure is like. Okay, now for the rest. Act 1. What happens in Act 1? This is where you introduce your main character. This is where you set up the status quo for that character at the beginning of the story. This is not going to be the same place that they should be in at the end of the story. There should be some change that occurs. They can start rich and they can end rich, but they have to come out of the story with a lesson learned or some kind of change, or it doesn't feel like there's much of a story. So the audience has to feel that you put the character through the paces. And Act 1 is the place where you introduce us to them. You give us a sense of what they want and also what their flaw is. The flaw is helpful in determining a character arc, because if they can overcome that flaw, recognize it in themselves, That's a good way to have a starting point. They don't necessarily need to understand what their flaw is. That's something that they can discover in the course of the story. They might be oblivious to it. Anyway, so once you introduce that, you introduce their status quo situation. Like, for example, are they married? Do they have kids, etc.? Do they have a job, etc.? Then you throw that out of balance. You put their life out of balance in some way, so they can lose their job, their wife can leave them, something like that. That's just an example. Don't follow that necessarily, but it gives you an idea. So their life is thrown out of balance by some event. It can be as shocking as watching their family die in a car crash or something. And then that sets them on a journey. That's their call to adventure. That is the thing where all of a sudden they're shaken out of their safe little life and they're forced into acting and doing something to change a situation that's occurred. And a lot of times they don't even have a choice in the matter. It's almost thrust upon them. And they have to do something, and they're motivated. And how you do that is very powerful if it's done right, because it makes people really care about what happens next. It makes them want to see whether they succeed or not. You want the audience to root for your character. You want them to care about what happens next. So this opening, this setup, is a critical part of the story because it determines whether or not the people who are watching this or reading this are going to be continuing or not, whether they're going to be engaged in it or not. And so this is why you've got to really carefully think about this particular sequence of events. Now, since I used the word sequence, I should add, forgot to mention this in the last video. I talked about acts and scenes, but actually there's another component, which is sequences. Sequences are in the middle between an act and a scene. A sequence is a section of scenes that tell a story within the act. So a sequence is like a mini story within your story, and it tells sometimes a 3-act structure inside of the sequence. And that sequence is could be the 3-act structure of your act. So you could have a sequence that's the first act of the act, and the sequence in the middle is the middle of your act, and then the sequence that concludes a set of sequences is your conclusion. But of course it doesn't conclude the actual story. It just concludes with the turning point. The turning point is also known as a trigger event. The trigger event is a scene that sets your character on a path with destiny. Literally, that is what it does. Because the character's life will never be the same again after that trigger event. And that's what you need to understand. Now, just so we're clear, these videos right now in the beginning, they're just laying the foundation and the groundwork for overall learning the basics. I'm not getting into finer details. I will be doing that later once we've covered all the groundwork. So this is just part 1 of a 3-part series of videos about 3-act structure. This is Act 1, and I will talk about Act 2 in the next episode. Again, I'm just keeping this kind of bare bones, just so you can get the basics down, and then we'll expand on it in the follow-ups. So that's it for the day, and I really appreciate your time and interest. Please check out my links below. Agenda has been funded, but it is still going. It's in demand, so you can still contribute to it if you want to. I would really appreciate it, and I hope you will subscribe to this channel and tell your friends about it. Thank you very much, and see you next time.